For large-scale operations, this can easily total in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. New lighting, HVAC, dehumidifiers, heat curtains, controllers not only can cost a fortune, but are expensive to operate. This is just the unfortunate reality of running a grow facility, but not anymore. If you've heard of a company called Green Rebates, then you already know what I'm talking about. Green Rebates changed the entire indoor cultivation industry seemingly overnight. They are the leading rebate and incentive management company in the US, and their sole purpose is to get you paid for the purchase of new grow equipment. Not a loan, real cash paid to growers. To date, Green Rebates has put more than $75 million back in the pockets of growers all across the nation. It doesn't matter if you've just purchased new equipment, are planning an expansion, opening a new facility, or maybe even just waiting for the economy to turn around before making any purchasing decisions. If you're a grower, you need to call the team at Green Rebates. They run an in-depth review of your facility to find all applicable equipment and energy rebates, and can connect you with every leading product manufacturer to find the right fit for your needs. Then they show up with a check. It won't cost you anything to find out how much money is being left on the table. Money that you can use to grow your business. Call Green Rebates, tell them you heard about them on the Cannabis and Tech Today podcast, and get ready to get paid. Welcome to another episode of Cannabis Tech Talks presented by Green Rebates. I'm your host, Aron Vaughan, and today I'm chatting with Sara Payan, host of the award-winning podcast Planted with Sara Payan. Sara's journey into the cannabis space wasn't driven by market opportunity or industry hype. It was a matter of survival. After being diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer, she turned to cannabis to help manage the side effects of treatment. That experience sparked a deeper curiosity that ultimately led her to become one of the most respected patient advocates and educators in the industry. In this conversation, Sara opens up about her personal healing journey, the evolution of cannabis education, and how her award-winning podcast, Planted with Sara Payan, became a platform for meaningful dialogue around plant medicine, policy, and social justice. Okay, so just to get started, I learned that your journey with cannabis began as a stage 3 colon cancer survivor.
Yeah.
How did that experience shape your approach to cannabis education and advocacy?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've always enjoyed cannabis. I was a precocious teen, and that's not me condoning kids using cannabis. It was just my journey. And I enjoyed it from time to time as an adult, but I put it this way, like before cancer, an eighth of cannabis would last me months. Like I would take a little puff and that was it. Um, I was when I well before I had my diagnosis with colon cancer, I just noticed that I was getting really, really sick every time I ate, and I was having cyclical vomiting that wasn't stopping. It was really bad, and they told me that I had IBS. And when I went to go see the gastroenterologist, he basically kind of patted me on the head and he's like, "You have IBS. I'll give you smooth muscle relaxants. We'll see you when you're 50." And I was like, "Well, you're actually going to see me when I'm 40 because my great grandmother died of colon cancer. So we have a genetic predisposition in our family." And the smooth muscle relaxants worked for a little bit, and I wasn't getting sick. And then I started getting sick again. And while I was waiting to get a second opinion, a friend of mine who had a medical card, because this was back in the 215 days in California, he was like, "Hey, Sara, what if I get you a gram of sunflower and you try it and see if that'll help?" Because I've so many friends are in the natural healing area. So I was getting things like ashwagandha, all these different herbs to see if they would help, soothe my issues. So he got me a gram of, I want to say that it was either Sensi Star or Blue Dream, or it could have been both. He probably got me a gram of both actually. And I smoked a little before I ate. And for the first time, I wasn't getting sick after eating, which was huge. And then I went in for the colonoscopy and they couldn't get the scope past the tumor. And my gastroenterologist was just freaked out because I was far too young. I was in my 30s, and it was like they were like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. This is crazy. You shouldn't be dealing with this." And so I got a resectioning of my colon, and out of the 24 lymph nodes that they removed around my colon, because the tumor was the size of a lemon,
Mm.
3 of those lymph nodes had cancer. So that meant I was stage 3 because it had left my colon.
Wow.
And so that meant I had to go through chemo. And my mom, she's retired since, but she was a clinical researcher. And she actually did the clinical trials on FOLFOX5, which is what I ended up taking. And it almost killed me twice. It was really
Oh.
a rough, rough chemo. But when I knew I was going to do chemo, I was terrified. But then part of me was like, ah, I can get my medical cannabis card. So, like, I was glad to use it as a tool, but I was also a little excited about the fact of getting like access, legal access to cannabis, because I was like, my whole life it had been, you have your guy, and my guy was like really hard to get a hold of. So I was like, wow, this will be interesting. I'm terrified about the chemotherapy, but I'm excited about the possibilities of using cannabis to help me through this. And, because of my mother, I knew that THC would help get you eating again. It would help with nausea. She would swear up and down that she said she didn't say anything about cannabis in general, just the cannabinoids. But I mean, I did try Marinol during my journey, and it was really gross and it didn't
Mm.
help. And I actually lost a whole weekend because I just felt really crabby and nasty. And I was visiting my mom where she was doing cancer research in Dallas. So, I couldn't travel with cannabis, which is why I took it. But I really lost my weekend with my mom. It was awful. So I got my card and I was able to use it not only to help with nausea and getting me eating again, but also to help in lieu of pain medications. And for somebody who's going through stage 3 colon cancer, there are medications that, doctors will give you that will help mitigate the effects of the therapies that you're going through, but they have their own side effects. So anti-nausea drugs like Zofran, um, pain medications like opiates, like I was using Vicodin then, after my resectioning, those secondary effects are constipation. And for your average person, it's not a big deal. You up your fiber, you do whatever. But when you're going through colon cancer, that can kill you.
Mm.
So being able to use something that was able to mitigate the effects of my chemotherapy and help with my recovery, um, from my resectioning without having dangerous side effects was a huge plus. And as somebody who, like, back in the day in my early 20s, I quit smoking cigarettes and it wasn't a big deal. They just told me, Sarah, you can't smoke anymore. I stopped. My friends were shocked because they were like, I'd had so many friends who had struggled with kicking nicotine. I have a very non addictive personality. But 2 weeks of being on opiates and then taking myself off, even though mentally I didn't want them, my body was going through a lot and it was going through withdrawal. And I also found that cannabis helped ease those symptoms so
Mhm.
that I didn't have discomfort as well. So I used that during my journey. And then a new dispensary opened towards the end of my chemo experience. And I didn't realize that it was actually a dispensary. I thought it was an apothecary. And I love stuff like that. And it ended up being a fancy little dispensary that made me feel like I wasn't doing something wrong.
Mm.
Because as lovely as everybody was in the dispensaries that I was going to, there was still that feeling of stigma of doing something illicit. And I actually got followed to my car once after visiting a dispensary. And when you're in a reduced because I looked a lot different then than I do now because I was really sick, you start to kind of worry about the safety of picking stuff up for your own health.
Mhm.
Um, but I ended up going to this dispensary. First week it was open. They had ice cream for sale. And I couldn't have it that week because I had neuropathy. And so with peripheral neuropathy, it doesn't just affect like your hands and feet. You can't eat or drink anything that's below a certain temperature or you'll literally choke.
Oh, I didn't
So
know that.
I didn't pick it up that week, and I went back the following week when my neuropathy had lessened and it wasn't on the menu anymore. And I asked the person behind the bar, I was like, hey, what's going on with that? And they said, Department of Public Health said that they couldn't carry anything that needed to be refrigerated or frozen in a dispensary because they would need food handling certifications. And I was like, well, that's silly, because you have it at like grocery stores. And for those of us going through chemotherapy isn't just directed at the cancer cells, it's directed at all rapidly dividing cells, which is why we lose our hair, we get a lot of gastrointestinal distress, we get sores and redness in our mouths, because these are all areas where like quickly, replicating cells reside, and those are the healthy cells.
Mm.
So one thing I mentioned to her was, we have to be really careful about the way we take care of our mouths during chemo. And the ice cream would be really soothing, but it would also behave as a topical. And so it could be a really good mode of use for people going through cancer. And she's like, hey, well, would you talk to my boss? So the executive director of the dispensary came out and we became friends. And he was like, would you write a letter to DPH for me? Because you have it's a really good argument. I was like, I work in civil rights. Yeah, of course. I'm happy to. So fast forward to being done with my treatment and recovering, I decided not to go back into the office, into nonprofits, and go back to school. And the executive director came up to me when I was in the dispensary and was like, hey, are you looking for a job? And I thought, you know, this could be fun. It could be like when I went to college the first time, I was always in management jobs. I didn't have any fun jobs like working at a record store or a coffee house or something like that. And I looked at it as being kind of akin to that. I was like, yeah, I'll stay while I'm getting my master's. I'll give you 4 years. And I stayed for 10, and I didn't get my master's. I ended up becoming director of education for the dispensary that I work for, creating internal training programs to start with, because one of the most healing things for me is being a year out of chemo, starting in a dispensary, being able to help people navigate a cannabis menu who were going through things that were not unlike what I had been going through.
Mhm.
And that was, I mean, it could be triggering at times, but by and large, it was incredibly healing. And it felt really good to be able to help people navigate their journey, because I didn't have that help. Like, the people at the dispensaries that I was going to were lovely, but when you're dealing with people who are critically ill, it can be really intimidating, and not knowing what to say, wanting to make sure that you're not giving health care advice. So people were just kind of like moonwalking away from me, just being like, well, you could try this, you could try that. I don't know, just try it and see how you feel. And so there were times where I had some missteps. It was uncomfortable the worst that happened was either I lost money on a product or was incredibly uncomfortable in my experience. But I didn't want anyone else to have to go through that, because as somebody who was in middle management, it was already incredibly expensive for me to be critically ill, much less people who are chronically and critically ill, like what they deal with, with their income and different things. It's a big gamble to try different products. So I started looking at how to educate staff in a way where they weren't behaving as healthcare providers, but behaving as navigators, to be able to help people figure out what works well for them, but also give them the language to take back to their physicians,
Okay.
so that they would have that communication. Because we were also going through a really challenging time where we were getting recommendations in the dispensary for cannabis, but to get these offices to verify the recommendations was challenging, because they were all worried about losing their licenses at that time.
Sure.
Because part of the training was also training staff and if we get busted by the feds. So it was a very different time where we were still worried about, the feds coming in. Doctors were still worried about losing their licenses over making recommendations. And we had a big disconnect over like having patients have access to cannabis as an alternative to other pharmaceuticals that may have greater complications. So I became the director of education, and as far as we could tell, I was the very first director of education for any dispensary.
Hmm.
And then I went on to be the public education officer, where I started doing public education classes, starting out with cannabis and cancer, doing the non-euphorics. Uh, there were 7 different classes that I did, and when we got into the pandemic, I transitioned from in-person classes to online, and I would get over 200 people from all over the world asking questions about the different modes of use, the different cannabinoids. And one of the biggest things was, why are these not available where I live? And that's when you get into the conversations about being politically active. Being somebody who has a nonprofit background that's really strong in civil rights and also um, economic equality, I felt very strongly about this, and that's why I ended up getting involved in policy um, during my tenure at my job in the dispensary, and I became the co-chair of the legalization task force in San Francisco before Prop 64 passed. And then I transitioned to the Cannabis Oversight Committee for San Francisco, and now I'm the vice chair of the state Cannabis Advisory Committee. And I think it's really important that we have really bad policies right now. A lot of them are creating massive extinction events in California and in other states. And the reason that these are allowed to happen isn't because policy is based on fact. It's based on state culture. It's based on stigma. And it's based on the fact that the people that we're voting into office have an outdated view of who the average cannabis user is. And the public has a very the public does not understand how much power they have to actually influence policy, because they need to reach out to the people who depend on their votes to keep their jobs, to let them know that, they are a productive member of society. They pay their taxes, they contribute to society, they have jobs, they use cannabis, and they vote. And so that's one of the things with Planted, when people were like, "Hey, Sarah, why don't you have a podcast?" And I thought, well, nobody wants to hear me drone on about weed. And they're like, "No, actually, it would be something really interesting." And so I got into it, of course, talking about education, because a lot of the educational work that I was doing, I created some of the first educational classes. I created the first curriculum at City College of San Francisco. And then I've lectured at UCSF, at Haas Business School, at Kaiser, and a lot of it was around, education about the science, conversations about policy and normalization, and when we see like the lens of prohibition, like what created that, talking about the historical aspects and policy today and what we can do to be involved, but also having the conversation about the business as a whole and how it's a unique opportunity to create abundance, but also support our communities, not as a panacea, as a lot of states have approached it, like, cannabis taxes will solve everything. No, but the way we tax and the way we give back to the community with lower taxes than what we're seeing now, of course, could be a really great blueprint for the way we look at all industry. What are they contributing to the community? Like what programs are they doing? Where's that money going? How's it being spent to, for harm reduction, for the schools, for what have you? But it shouldn't totally rely on cannabis. So, really, like, the podcast has been about getting people active, getting people voting, looking at cannabis as a canvas for critical thought in a lot of things that we do, because as we know, cannabis is a really great representation of not all things that are illegal are bad, and not all things that are legal are good, And so it's a call to action. It's a call for greater thought. It's a call for exploration and curiosity. And I like to be able to mix my guests with, people who are creating impact in our industry, whether it's through the business, through social action and policy, but also getting people that are celebrities involved too, and doing my interviews with them, because I like to say conversation is normalization. So one of the things, last year I did an interview with Forbes, and they are asking me, what makes your podcast different from others? And actually I said, what makes your podcast better than others? And I was like, it's not about better. It's about lots of different lenses. It's about all hands on deck. Now, a differentiator for the podcast from others is that I think a lot of times we create a lot of content that's just for the industry, and that's great. It's important. And at times, if we have too much of that, it can be an echo chamber. And
Mhm.
we're talking to ourselves about things that we all agree on or don't, because we always see some really interesting arguments on LinkedIn. I mean, it's there. But it's more about reaching out beyond our sphere of where we all know what's going on, and really engaging the public and starting to change, the way that they think about it, or have them question what they think about it, because that opinion, those conversations that are having outside of the industry, are what are going to that's going to shape policy. It's going to decrease stigma. We can do a lot as an industry to decrease stigma and change policy, but the biggest factor is going to be that whole group of people that aren't even involved in this, that are, that may be consumers, or they may be curious, or somebody in their lives may have been positively impacted. Like, I had MSNBC's Michael Steele has been on the show a couple of times, and Michael does not consume cannabis. And he also understands the importance of people having safe access. And that's one of the important conversations that I have in my education programs is, we are walking chemistry experiments. Even though we create our own endogenous cannabinoids, some of us do not tolerate phytocannabinoids. And the biggest message with that is, and that's okay. That doesn't mean other people shouldn't have access. We need to have lots of different modes of use. So when we're looking at policies in different areas where they allow certain things but they don't allow others, let's have the conversation why we need to have lots of different modes of use. Because we're walking chemistry experiments, we all react differently to the different modes of use. There needs to be lots of different safe ways to use it, so that people can make the most effective use out of it, if it works for them. And if it doesn't, that's okay.
It's a great message. Yeah. Well, you covered a lot of ground there. I'd like to maybe run over a couple of things that you said in more detail. So, um, you're saying as a member of the California Cannabis Advisory Committee and the San Francisco Cannabis Oversight Committee, you're talking about better policy. What specific changes do you think are most urgently needed for the cannabis industry in California, and then as a model for the rest of the country?
Yeah, well, I think some of the most important things are lowering the barrier to entry and also lowering taxes. We have a huge taxation problem in California. We have excise tax that hits cannabis every time it changes hands. And that does not create safe access for consumers because it's extraordinarily expensive. It also doesn't create a very stable industry, because when I first started in cannabis, growers were making anywhere between $3,000 and $3,500 a pound. Now they're lucky to get $4 an eighth. That's a huge difference. Not to mention the fact of all of the different things that they need for permitting, different requirements that they need to meet that are extraordinarily expensive. So when we look at the fact that the state of California is not happy with the fact that they have not reaped the benefits of taxes as much as they thought they would, but they continue to raise them hoping to get more. And then they're taking some of that money and using it towards enforcement against the traditional market. And they're giving money to groups that are making a lot of money creating biased research about the harms of cannabis rather than unbiased research that may uncover both sides of that. We have a huge disconnect. If we had lower taxation, we would have more consumers participating in the legal market, which would also support businesses,
Mhm.
and the state would be getting more back in taxes. They would be achieving a lot more, and they wouldn't have to spend as much on enforcement because there wouldn't be as as big of a traditional slash illicit market to be contending with.
Right. No, that makes a
And
lot of sense.
I mean, because people want to participate. Like when we were looking at pre-legalization in the before Prop 64, one of the things that we were talking about when we were getting into enforcement, I was like, we have to look at the fact that the people that are working in the traditional market are also entrepreneurs. They're entrepreneurs. They're skilled hash makers. They're skilled cultivators. These are people that are very talented, but they do not want to participate or cannot participate in an expensive venture like that. We also need to have more conversations about when we look at social equity, what that looks like. Because we should be able, the people who risk their lives as entrepreneurs to work in a legal industry should have the opportunity to succeed in a legal industry. What we are able to talk about every day, there are still people in jail because of their work in cannabis. They should be out. I mean, these are huge things that we really need to be looking at. And then finally, as we've seen from the LA Times articles, we have to get a handle on testing because whether we're calling it, adult recreational use or medicinal use, this is a substance that people are consuming and it should be safe. And so we need to figure out how to have third party testing that is not, people can't lab shop,
Right.
and they have to be able to adjust they should be given the opportunity to correct what's going on, but they shouldn't be allowed to put that product on shelves.
Agreed.
And really just look at, like, how do we keep how do we keep track of, there are more and more different pesticides and analogs of these pesticides that are coming in from other countries that are not, on the state's list of things to look for. How do we create something that where you may not be able to keep up to date all the time, but how do you, like, keep up with it and create a protocol to to keep the public safe? And it's a very interesting quandary because people want to point fingers at the companies, they want to point fingers at the state, but the fact of the matter is we're a nascent industry and we're figuring this stuff out. And, yes, of course there are bad players, but there are also people that are doing their very best, that sometimes they're making mistakes and they're missing the mark and they're trying to figure things out. So how do we support them without turning them into villains as well? It's
Sure.
all very, very complicated. It's all very nuanced in an industry that likes to see things as black and white, and we hear people calling one another out all the time. We have to get on track and work together, and along with that, we need hemp and cannabis need to work together as well. We need to be able to create more safety in the hemp field. We need to create safety in cannabis, but take down some of the draconian measures that are making it really hard to do business.
Mhm.
And if we all work together, we would be seeing a lot more positive change that benefits all of us because we would have greater lobbying power as well. But we have so much infighting that it's making it really, really hard to do a lot of the work. And I'm so grateful for a lot of wonderful colleagues that are out there that are doing the work. They're not making a lot of money. They're doing it because they believe in it. I don't think there any of us who really care about what's going on are getting terrifically rich off of any of this.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a scary thought to think about with how regulated cannabis is and how much it needs to be tested.
Hmm.
Um, what isn't being tested? I mean, our vegetables aren't being tested to that level, right? Any imported food is not being tested to that level, and I'm sure some of the same pesticides are being used. So, if anything, of course, you have to have a safe product. But if anything, cannabis is probably a lot safer than a lot of the food that we consume on a daily basis.
Yeah, I mean, we're held to a higher standard than organic farming. And that being said, I think, all food should be, any agriculture should be held to a high standard. But then you have to create the balance because there are
Right.
other things that are just far too high, like taxation. You could if you had lower taxes, if permitting and all the costs to do business were lower, we'd be able to invest more money in creating safe product and, creating measures to create that balance so that they could keep their eyes out for different changes and different things that need to be done. It's really important that we do that. We don't want to have that Tylenol moment in cannabis. It's
The
very.
Tylenol moment.
So, do you remember it was back in the 80s when somebody tampered with Tylenol? And actually this came from a conversation I had with Michael Steele. They tampered with Tylenol, and so a bunch of people died because there was that's why we have tamper-proof seals on everything now because of that. And for
Interesting.
years, like, people were afraid of using Tylenol because of that.
Huh.
Yeah.
Okay. No, fair enough.
Yeah. So a little different, but still it's around the stigma. Like, that product carried stigma for a very long time after because of that. And we
Mhm.
don't want to create that kind of stigma. We want to have balanced conversation. So, we have colleagues that talk about cannabis as basically being a panacea, that it's good for everything, it heals everything. And we have to be real about that. That is not true. It helps a lot of things. From a harm reduction standpoint, it's incredibly helpful. For symptom management standpoint, it's incredibly helpful. But when somebody in the past introduced me as Sarah, the girl who cured her cancer with cannabis, I will tell you that is not true. Did it
Right.
help? Absolutely. Were there secondary effects that helped with my cancer? Maybe. I know that I've seen that with my compassion programs that I ran. There were people who were doing poorly with their cancers, and they started having a regular regimen of cannabinoids, and the doctors were like, I don't know what you're doing, but keep doing it
Hmm.
because we're seeing benefits. But could I put my finger on what it was that happened? Only researchers that are doing, creating the protocols and doing the research at that level can say for sure what's going on with that.
Right. And we haven't had that long to be able to research that either. So,
No.
like you said, as it's a nascent industry, the research is still fairly new as well because there was such a long ban on any kind of cannabis research. And, following on from legalization and hopefully national legalization, then we might start to have psychedelic research as well, for psilocybin and MDMA and those kinds of things, and be able to see some of the positive impacts they have, not only mentally, which we've definitely seen anecdotally and in some research, but possibly physically as well. I mean, we don't know until we do the research. Yeah, going back to the podcast, Planted with Sara Payan, you talked a little bit about trying to reach a broader audience and, not make it so much of an echo chamber. How do you balance those two? Uh, how do you give enough time to the industry insiders while also, while not scaring off some people who may be casual consumers or, just curious about cannabis?
Yeah. I mean, it's a delicate balance, and you're not going to please everybody. And that's, I think, the one thing. It's like that joke, you can't make everyone happy. You're not tacos, you know. But I try to create a balance by highlighting people who are doing great work, who are relatable, along with having the normal conversations around that are more normalizing with celebrities. I really try to strike a balance. I really try to look at representation. Before I was getting celebrities on the show, I just really made sure that we were highlighting people in the industry who may not get as much attention, like really looking at, you know, women and people of color and people who may be doing interesting things that aren't necessarily who you'd be seeing at Benzinga, that aren't like, big money makers, but they're looking at different things around policy and civil rights and how to create just a more equitable landscape. I would love, and I don't know that it'll happen in our time, I would love to be able to see a world where there's more conversations about what people bring to the table with their skill sets and their heart than what they look like or what their gender is, but we are not there yet, you know? And
Sure.
so, really trying to just create a well-rounded representation of who's at the table or who should be,
Hmm.
and part of that too is the conversation around, when we look at the retail landscape and there's a lot of businesses that are hurting and they wonder why. And one of the biggest issues is that once we get into legalization and adult or recreational use, medicinal use often gets lost in the fray. And they're like, oh, we don't have to have that conversation anymore because we don't need that loophole. Well, guess what? What we found was that when we got into legalization, more and more people weren't just using cannabis to get high. They were curious about looking at it as something for wellness in their everyday lives. People were coming in who'd never been into a dispensary before saying, hey, can I use this for sleep? Can I use this for anxiety? I have a certain type of discomfort. Can we have a conversation about that? Because I'd really like to not use ibuprofen anymore. But, when we're starting to see this formula retail environment where the staff aren't even being trained correctly, which also, like, one of the biggest myths is that the turnover of bud tenders is incredibly high. So why train them? Well, guess what? If you train people, if you engage them, if you give them professional development, they actually stay and become evangelists for your company because they're happy. Like, I don't know anybody, and I could be wrong. There may be people that I have not met that feel this way, but 8+ hours of your life at a job where you don't have any personal investment or interest in doesn't seem like that would be a very life-giving thing for anybody, you know? So when we're avoiding having the conversations about using cannabis for wellness and targeting that very large audience and market, that's a major disconnect. And that was something that with my work, when I worked as an educational professional in retail, that I really worked against. I had very engaged people in my company with very low turnover, and we did the testing, and it shows that if you actually take the time to create opportunities for consumers to learn and engage with products and ask questions, it really does benefit sales because you're getting successful outcomes. You're not just selling just to sell. You've become a matchmaker and
Right.
you've become a trusted source. And there's a lot more to creating those trusted relationships where people come back, the true blue fans, as you'd say, like in the music industry, than running specials and having people come in and just basically, looking at their dispensaries and seeing who has the best deals.
Right, right. No, 100%. So, I'd like to learn a bit more, about retail versus medical. I mean, is there a way where bud tenders could essentially be pharmacists, so they can go to school and focus in a cannabis related chemistry major maybe, and then they could give advice to consumers, because it is tough when you're not a healthcare professional and maybe you've had the training and you do know a lot about cannabis strains and what might work for different symptoms and different disorders, but you can't then give that advice.
Right. Yeah, you can't. I mean, there are programs. I mean, there's a program in Maryland that people can do, but it doesn't make them a pharmacist. It just gives them a master's in cannabis science. You could go to pharmacy school. I actually know a few people who were working in cannabis and did go to pharmacy school. But of course, you're not going to be hired to be behind the bar because you're far too expensive
Sure.
unless the
Yep.
state requires it.
Yeah.
But there are opportunities for people who want to grow in their careers and do more than, be behind the bar. However, if you are behind the bar, there's also, you don't have to be a doctor, you don't have to be a healthcare provider, nor should you be behaving like one. But what you can do, and what I did when with my staff and personally as somebody who works with individuals and physicians, is help create that safe container for experimentation. Because the fact of the matter is, going back to something that you said just a little bit ago about, different modes of use, different types of cannabis for different sorts of problems. We have a baseline on how the majority of human beings respond. I have over 20,000 hours of experience with human beings in cannabis, and I've seen everything from the average reaction to people tripping out on a 30-to-1 ratio of CBD to THC.
Hmm.
We are walking chemistry experiments. So we can give people the information on how the majority of people respond, and we have to give people opportunities and tools to track their own responses so they figure out what works well for their bodies, and then give them the information to be able to give back to their physicians. And that's a successful way of being behind the bar, being able to help people navigate a menu by asking. I would do, teach inquiry and coaching and things like that, asking people more questions about what's going on with them, because people often know more about themselves than they give themselves credit for. So there are ways to coach people and inform people through the process without giving medical advice. And that's where we want to be as an industry. And then, if you're interested in going beyond that and becoming more specialized and actually getting into medicine, there are opportunities to be able to do that. However, the chances of you actually working in a dispensary are going to be very low because you're going to be very expensive. So you may want to do your own practice then once you have those credentials.
Sure. Yeah, that's the problem, isn't it? It's,
It is.
once you're actually qualified to be a healthcare professional, then you're not going to be a bud tender. So
That's
that's
it. So,
that's the rub.
the big question is like, how do we be our most helpful selves behind the bar without overstepping
Hmm. Yeah.
our boundaries?
Again, it's a balance.
It
Um,
is.
yeah, well, just to wrap up, looking ahead, New Year 2025, what are you excited about, both, for the podcast and your personal projects, and then also just for the future of cannabis education and policy and new product innovation? What are you excited about in the world of cannabis?
Well, I'm starting out 2025 on a hopeful note. Um, you know, I have. I'm trying to look at it with a lot more hopefulness than the worry that we've had in the past few years. Um, I'm curious about what's going to happen on a national scale with cannabis policy, and I'm not sure where we're going to be.
No, it's hard to know, isn't it?
It
Because I know
is.
Kamala Harris outlined her plan for legalization. I know Trump has said that he's open to rescheduling to Schedule 3, but he hasn't been anywhere near as open about what his actual plans are for cannabis. I know that RFK Jr., head of HHS, is much more open to cannabis rescheduling and legalization. So he may listen to him on that. But yeah, it's a big question mark. It's kind of like Pandora's box, and it hasn't quite been opened yet.
No, it hasn't. And even, when Harris was talking about her plan, it wasn't it was very much an outline. We didn't really get a lot of information from her on it, which I have to give her credit. She's the first candidate that's had the conversation, really saying that she would support it, and that's huge. And there wasn't a lot of delving into what that actually meant. So, there's that. I know that in the past, Trump has been more about states' rights and leaving it to the states. I think that we're going to see a lot of that, especially because I think that also serves like some of the larger multi-state operators as well to be states' rights.
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens with that. It's an interesting thing. I really, really, really would hope that we would go more towards descheduling. I had the two former the chairs and founders of the Congressional Cannabis Caucus, Congresswoman Barbara Lee and Congressman Earl Blumenauer, on the show a couple of times.
Oh, cool.
And they've both said that they feel hopeful, that they've had really great conversations with everybody who's, in the caucus, that there are frameworks that are already available that we'd easily be able to slip into for legalization on a federal scale. Um, you know, uh, Congressman Blumenauer said that he had some great conversations with AOC about that. But it remains to be seen, because, as we know, it's the politics is a game of fluctuating influence, and so
Good way
we
of
have
putting
to
it.
be really, we have to be really active, and these people who are there that depend on our votes for their jobs, we need to be reaching out to them. So I really hope that we see something, loosening up with, rescheduling. I'd rather see descheduling. I would love to see some things going, 280E going away, have more opportunities for banking, because that is when we'll start to see an influx of cash, and people won't be worried about losing their jobs, and companies won't be worried about folding, because they'll have a little bit more runway to get up to speed. And that's, I'd also, I'd like to see more. I'd like to see more positive movement in social equity. But as we're looking at this new presidency, I'm not sure that that's going to be something that's a focus. I would say that it probably is not, because we still hear today, Justin Trudeau just announced he's stepping down, and people are saying that, part of his failure was his wokeness. So we're going through a very interesting time as far as people being seen and people's rights and who gets what. So I feel like we have to, we can't despair. We have to really work together. People need to understand, crossing the aisle when people are, especially when we have the same feelings about things, the same purpose, the same drives. We need to just stop working against one another and work together. I think if we can look at 2025 as a year of cohesion in the industry, not just within cannabis, but cannabis and hemp, it would behoove us to do that. I feel hopeful. I mean, I'm very excited about this next season of Planted. We had great guests last year. We had, a Rick Steves, we had Jesse Ventura, we had Barbara Lee, Earl Blumenauer, Jorma Kaukinen from Jefferson Airplane. This year, Jesse Ventura is coming back on the show, so I'm
Cool.
really excited about that. We have Ricky Williams coming on, Montel Williams, a lot of other fun celebrities, and a lot of our colleagues that are doing great work that I'll be announcing soon, which is really exciting. In January, I'm really doing a lot to highlight some of the women that are doing great work in our industry. And of course, every November, we highlight the craft farmer, although we like to do that throughout the year, because one of the things that we really like to talk about, there's room for everybody in the industry, but the group that started all of this, that needs our support, that is struggling, is the small craft farmer. And so creating more highlights around what they're doing and the importance of their work is near and dear to my heart, along with creating good policy.
Yeah, well said. I agree. Yeah. Well, anything else that you would like to plug?
Aaron, right now I can't think of anything. I mean, we're in the midst of, we have so much content. We have content that's going to go through the spring. So we're really excited about that. I guess, one of the things that I'd like to bring up is that we've had some really great relationships with our sponsorship partners. And so there are a lot of wonderful opportunities for people to get involved. Our listenership has been just skyrocketing, which has been wonderful. I've been
Awesome.
so
Great to hear.
grateful for that.
Well, I mean, it's very important content, so that's great to hear.
Thank you. Thank you. It's one of those things where when you're looking at the podcasting space, a lot of people start it. It's a lot of work. but you have to really love what you do for it to be successful. And for me, it's been a labor of love. Like, we are on our 6th year, and, like you, I really enjoy my work and being able to talk to our colleagues and help disseminate a lot of this, not only for our colleagues, but for the greater community. And so it's just incredibly exciting. And hey, the cherry on the sundae, last year was winning the MJ for Content Creator of the Year. It was a huge surprise, because the people that were in my area were all amazing. And it was a huge honor. It was a huge honor to be nominated, to be amongst my colleagues in the nominations. And I really had no idea that I was going to win. It was, I thought that I would be hugging somebody else and telling them congratulations.
Well, yeah, no, of course. I mean, it's great to get the recognition, but I think when you're talking about your guests, and it's not just about like people in the industry or like the bigger players. I think you choose people who you would be interested to speak to, and you think have a unique perspective, and like you said, maybe should be at the table. So the fact that they interest you and you want to have a conversation with them, I think other people probably feel the same way, and that probably comes through. I mean, it does. It comes through in your podcast. So I think
Thank you.
that's where you've got like the special ingredient there.
Well, I'm incredibly lucky to be able to see people and be like, hey, I want to have a conversation with that person, and then to be able to do it,
Right.
and it's and that we both enjoy it. Because one of the things that makes there are two things that make my heart super happy about the podcast. One, cultivators tell me that it's their favorite podcast to listen to while they're in the field, and that
Oh,
is
awesome.
it's a huge,
Yeah.
compliment. And two, having my guests want to come back, because they say that being on the show is like having coffee with an old friend. And you
Right.
know for me, it's not about the gotcha questions. It's about having a real conversation and creating a safe, friendly place to be able to do that, because we need more spaces like that. That's how we create greater conversations, and we're able to have a meeting of the minds. And though we may not always agree, we can have friendly civil discourse over things, because that's super important, especially
Right.
now.
That's what podcasts have done. I mean, no longer do we have the corporate media where that's the only place that we can go, and we have maybe 5-minute segments where someone has to get in their specific talking points, their biggest talking points, and then you don't get to learn anything more under the surface. So that's
Yeah,
what this new format has allowed us to be able to do.
that's it. And one thing I am excited about, we are we made a small announcement at the end of the year, but we're doing a media partnership with Fat Nugs magazine.
Oh,
And so,
cool. Okay.
yeah, each one of their issues will have a transcript from one of our episodes that corresponds with the theme of the magazine.
Oh, that's perfect.
So
Yeah.
it's going to be really, really cool.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, like, since we're talking in your magazine, I was like, I didn't know if you'd want me to put that out there, but
Oh no, that's totally fine. I mean,
is
yeah,
it
it's a
cool?
community, so
Oh, see, Eric,
yeah,
see,
we're not
you're my
rivals.
kind of journalist.
Yeah, right. I mean, like we're all trying to bring the industry forward, and we're all advocates for the plant at the end of the day.
I love that, because I feel that way about other podcasts as well. It's like I have a lot of favorite podcasts that I like to listen to, that when people like what Planted is doing and they ask me for more information on other podcasts, I always love. It's all hands on deck. It's all of our lenses. It's really cool. It's really good.
It is, and it really is a great industry. It is a community. That's what I've found. It's a big
Yeah,
extended family. So, and like you said, if we can all work together a little bit more, then we'll be able to make some real strides.
it's true. And I like talking about us more as a community than an industry. I mean, when we're getting into data and statistics and everything, of course, that's more industry focused. But I still, in the midst of all the things that are going on, we still have our heart. And there are still people who are here for the very reasons that I've stayed all these years. Because
Right.
it's been 12 years now, and I told myself I would stop doing it when it stopped being my heart's work. And if I hadn't gotten sick, I wouldn't have found that. 15 years ago, I told you were nuts if you said, Sarah, you're going to be not only working in cannabis, but you're going to be in policy and doing a podcast. I would have been like, what are you talking about? And I was always on the search for my heart's work, and I found it in the weirdest of ways.
That's often how it goes.
Isn't it though? I mean, you gotta go with the flow. It's like when people ask me, what's your biggest advice being in the industry? It's like, well, you have to love it, and you have to be like water, and you have to be able to just kind of flow through the rocks and the boulders, and just really find your people, and there are a lot of great people, and I'm so grateful for that.
In the world of infused edibles, gummies rule. But let's be real, not all gummies are created equal. If you're looking to make truly tasty infused gummies, Melt2Make can help. Melt2Make is committed to making gummy production simple, efficient, and all natural, offering gelatin, pectin, and sugar-free pectin gummy bases in a range of flavors. They provide step-by-step instructions, equipment lists, and dosing calculators, so whether you're established in the market or you're just getting started, Melt2Make is the perfect gummy manufacturing solution. To learn more, visit us at melt2make.com.